everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Guided Reading Lessons with Students who are reading in this advanced reading stage. So I'm really excited that you're joining me today. And so what we will be doing is just jumping right in and thinking together about what we do with students who are reading in these advanced levels. So let me do a quick share here to get you to the computer and the PowerPoint and get us all rolling. Let's see. I hope everybody's doing well in this time at home, and that everybody's getting used to some of the social distancing and online learning and all the work that we're doing. So again, thank you so much for joining today, or whenever you are joining in to watch this piece. This is our last one of the series on guided reading. So thanks so much for coming in today. We will be, again, I've said this every single time, we're using this reading development chart very heavily throughout these series because these are the reading behaviors. When people say what kind of things do we work on with kids, in guided reading, these reading behaviors are really the work. They're the things that we're noticing the development of, and they're also the behaviors that the books have been created to develop as kids are working their way through across this reading continuum. So again, as I said, this is the last of the webinars, and that webinar series is all up at myokapi.com. And this last one, yesterday's and today's, will be uploaded probably the next day or so if it's not already there. Well, this one obviously is not there. But today we're going to be thinking about kids in these stages, really 3rd, 4th, and 5th grades. We will also, if you are an administrator or a coach, we are going to be working on this additional webinar that will be for those students who are just beginning in kindergarten, those early emergent learners who are reading at levels A and B. So we're going to be talking a lot about them in that additional piece. And again, if there are additional webinars that you would like to think about together, please send Pat an email at pat@myokapi.com. We've got a couple of ideas and suggestions on some different things already, so just put your voice out there. Today we'll be thinking about what guided reading looks like at these reading stages, and then thinking about what that facilitation work is as a teacher, and then thinking more about what happens after the kids are after we finish with the book in guided reading, or we're finished with guided reading. So one of the questions that comes up a lot is whether or not we need to still have guided reading in these grades 3, 4, and 5. And the way I always think about it is, yes, we do, because when we think about the work that we're doing here, what we're trying to support is kids learning to read and think in these really important and powerful and deep ways. And so, even when you've got kids that are reading in these higher levels, we really want to make sure that we're coaching kids to be able to read and think and to stretch. Because I always, my question back to people when they say, do these kids still need guided reading? And I'm like, well, are there still things that they need to learn about reading? And I always try and think that, they're constantly learning how to read. We're always learning how to read. This is not a K2 learns to read and 3-5 reads to learn. It's you're learning to read, and you are reading to learn in all of the stages and all the grades. Guided reading is also not an intervention. So you don't want to think of this as a time when I'm going to pull kids in a small group and, have that intervention on a particular skill or a strategy. So it's not that kind of work. It's also not literature circles, because that's one of the things that also begins to happen in these grades, is people begin to think of small group as being just a literature circle. So it's not intervention, it's not literature circles, it's going to be something different. And this is that time for us to support kids as they are reading, thinking, and talking their way in a really purposeful and an intentional way as they're reading into these texts. And it's an opportunity for the kids to apply strategies that they already know and be able to read this unfamiliar text independently with success. And be thinking about that kind of collaboration, because that collaborative work that they do in guided reading really supports them to be able to think beyond what they could do if they were just reading on their own. So as they work through, and they're, we're working with the kids on the work in these stages. What we're going to zoom in on today are these Fluent Plus and Advanced Fluent stages of reading development. And so when you look at text in these levels, for example, the N through P, if you joined me yesterday, we talked a little bit about these two pieces as well. One of the things that I try and think a lot about is that this is the time when we're starting to get that real range of and variety of different text features that come in. So when kids are reading in nonfiction, we want to be able to support them to, to learn to use the text in the running text, as well as all of the different features and graphics that are offered to support that fuller meaning. And as they move up in levels, one of the things that we know is that in nonfiction, the visuals become and graphics become more complex and more numerous, and are so important to really being able to understand the ideas that are there. And the other thing that starts happening is that variety of genre become even more important, because as kids move up in levels, when you're a first grade teacher, we've got lots of levels that we want kids to be able to take on. But as you move into these third, fourth, and fifth grade, it becomes less about moving up levels than about going wide in a level, making sure that kids are able to read and think and talk in the ways that all the kinds of texts would be that would be represented in here. We want them to really be able to learn to use genre as a way of organizing their thinking, anticipating and organizing. And then also becoming more aware of the kinds of language that they're running across in these books that support meaning. One of the examples I showed from this yesterday was in the salamander book that you see on the left, where it says all salamanders breathe air to get oxygen into their bodies. There are 4 different ways that salamanders do this. When a reader is coming across language like that in a text, it prepares their brains to begin to organize the kind of information that's going to be shared throughout the rest of the text chunk that they're reading. And then one of the other things that should also be apparent is that your brain should be recognizing if it's understanding, what are the 4 different ways that salamanders get oxygen into their bodies. And if you get to the end of the piece and you can't really, name those or call those out, then maybe you need to do some rereading and think about, what have I missed here as I'm reading. Always Lucy Calkins always talks about how your brain should have sirens go off when it doesn't make sense. And one of the ways I think that we want to help kids to recognize and check in on their meaning is whether or not they're attending to some of those language cues that are offered in a text like that. Then one of the things that starts happening as they move into these advanced stages, I took advanced while it's one column on that reading development chart, and I kind of divided it into an advanced early and an advanced a little bit later. But when you start moving into text at these levels, one of the things that I start thinking about is the kids are really, it's so important that they're able to demonstrate strategies from previous behaviors, but also they begin to be expected to synthesize ideas across a single text as well as multiple texts. And so to support that, one of the things that's going to happen in texts in these levels is that there's a lot of layering of different text types. For example, the text on the right has maps, it has think about boxes, it has personal reflection pieces, photographs. So it's got such an integration of the ways of sharing that meaning. And a reader has to really integrate all of those graphics and all of those different kinds of text that might be occurring. And then when you look to the text that's on the left, this food web, looking at some of those different ways that an author is going to share their thinking out, which will then support them as they begin to think about how they're going to share their own thinking. One of the expectations of kids as they move into these advanced stages is that they're able to make judgments about the parts of the text that are important for meaning. And so sometimes kids, they get caught up in what's in the photograph, for example, in the food web, but not necessarily recognizing the meaning that's conveyed through the arrows and the direction of the arrows and what those mean. So one of those things I'm always trying to think about is how to help kids to evaluate the impact of those graphical devices and the way that they affect your thinking, and being very aware of that. So one of the things that begins to happen as kids move into these advanced stages is that the visuals are really preparing kids for the kinds of real world thinking and navigating of text that they have to do on websites, other types of online media. And those kinds of texts are not going to be constructed in such a linear fashion. Sometimes books, kids tend to go from the beginning to the end, but one of the things that we try and build into these advanced reading stages and guided reading texts is that kids have to do a lot of different types of navigation around on the page as well as throughout the book in order to make the fullest meaning. And then as they get into these more advanced stages later on, we're going to begin to see that our readers are really being asked to think about what knowledge they already have about recurring themes. They're expected to bring the kinds of background knowledge that they have already found in texts. For example, if they were reading about an environmental message in this book about orangutans, or looking at the history of child labor in society, one of the things that these advanced texts also do is they give kids the opportunity to experience the different ways that authors can present their ideas and the kinds of language that they use to share their points of view. One of the things I'm always aware of as well is the use of primary sources as kids are discussing historical pieces, as well as thinking about how it relates to current day. So they'll start running across more and more of these. And through the exposure to text like this, our kids are really positioned to think critically about ideas and to recognize and analyze bias and propaganda and stereotyping, which is something that we want kids to have that space to learn to think in those ways around text, so that we can coach and support them to understand the different ways that texts are constructed, that no text is going to be neutral, and that we have to learn to recognize and think about the different ways that texts are affecting us as readers and as learners. So one of the things I just am always aware of is that guided reading gives me that opportunity to reinforce the work that I'm doing in whole group and shared reading and read aloud, so that kids are able to come into text in a way that is really helping them to understand how texts are constructed. We're certainly going to be expanding their background knowledge as they're reading these texts, but also background about how texts work is going to be a really powerful learning that happens as kids are working in these different texts and at these different levels. And just always thinking about the more that we think well together, the more that our kids are going to be thinking well alone. To quote Peter Johnston here, it is so important that we think about every opportunity that kids are with us, that we're supporting them in the habits of mind for when they get out there to do this work independently. So let's think about what that looks like. What does it look like when you get into guided reading with kids in these upper grades? So a guided reading text structure, there's an introduction. So in this introduction, this before reading portion, I think about setting up talk work, setting up reading work, and then orienting kids to the ideas in the book. And when I say orienting them to them, I provide the opportunities for them to do this work themselves, because by this point, we would expect that kids are able to introduce a book to themselves in the sense of getting themselves ready for the topic, beginning to anticipate ideas, beginning to anticipate vocabulary within the text. Then there would be a reading and discussing portion. And in this part, the kids are leading the discussion. Oops, and I've got some sort of letters that have appeared on my screen I didn't miss. Sorry about that. But the students are reading the text independently, and they're reading silently within this. And so that's one of those things to really be aware of in text. In these text levels, we do not want kids reading out loud. We don't want round robin reading. We want kids to be processing and thinking well inside their heads. We'll talk a lot here about that notion of being able to facilitate a conversation with kids. And that's the place where I'm going to be checking for understanding. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this as we unpack what we see happening in the guided reading lesson in videos. And then after the reading and discussion, there's going to be a closure piece. And that's going to give us an opportunity to reflect on the work that's happened in the lesson. That would be reflecting on the reading work as well as reflecting on the talk work. All right, so let's take a look at the group of kids that we're going to be seeing in this video. So the group that we're going to see, these kids are fifth graders, and it's the end of their fifth grade year. So it was towards the very end of the year. They were a new group of kids coming together. They had worked with me the previous week, so you're going to hear us referencing some of the work that we did as we read another book about called The Salmon Stream the week before. These kiddos had just come off of their SBAC testing, and I think it really reflects in the way that they're approaching the text. They tend to be um, more aware of finding text to read aloud, because when you ask them for their thinking, they tend to read text aloud because I think they've spent so much time finding text evidence to support their thinking. These kiddos had also, their teacher shared with me, they used a very structured talk protocol when they would work in small groups in their classroom, where one person would share an idea and then each person commented on that idea. And so they were very used to that model. And so I kind of upended things a little bit the week before, where I was asking them to just share their thinking when they were ready. And you'll see that some of the kids are more comfortable with that than others. Some of them are a little more self-directed and self-initiating. Others are a little less comfortable with that kind of everyone share their thinking when they have an idea. So if you notice in this group, I've got 5 kids here in guided reading. Typically, guided reading is 6 kids or fewer. And I usually, and personally, I really prefer to have about 4 in the group, 4 to 6 rather, not just 2. Because I think once the group gets so small, then it becomes more of a conference kind of setting, which has a different kind of processing. So what we don't want to do, though, is get our group too big, because if there are too many kids in the group, you get less discussion by each kid, which really kind of ends up defeating the purpose of having a collaborative small group. And the teacher oftentimes ends up doing more work than they really need to do because of the management kinds of things. So these five kids, we got Tyler, Samantha, Rosalind, Maddie, and David. David is an English learner, and so is Samantha. Rosalind is an English learner, but her English is absolutely strong. She's multilingual. And Tyler and Maddie, English is their first language. And so this is a group of kiddos that you're going to see doing some work. The week before, I had talked with them about and noticed a lot of the different kinds of work that they were doing as we were reading The Salmon Stream. And this was one of the charts that I had created to have us talk about some of the work. So I was, again, noticing and naming the work that they were already doing, noticing how they were using diagrams and photographs and visuals to help them understand the ideas in the text. They talked about, how they were figuring out words. That was some of the articulation that we were doing the week before. One of the things that we were talking about was how sometimes it helps to sketch out or act out a visual to help us understand ideas, as well as to talk about our own thinking. Noticing how they were feeling about what we were reading was really an idea that I began to notice. They kind of had that read it, tell you about it, flat sort of reading, and I wanted them to start to recognize the feelings that they were having around these ideas of within the text, and it helped to notice how it was helping us to become interested. We were jotting very important points, just jotting down ideas and things like that to help us to think about the text that we were reading. One of the things that the kids were doing in this is they were doing a lot of reading away from the guided reading group and then coming back in. So one of the techniques that we used was this jotting technique. A lot of teachers use that. So we just called it very important points. And then recognizing that they really have to think about what they're reading. Those were some big ideas. So these kids were very solidly into this advanced fluent stage. So you'll see the work that they're doing. One of the things, if you're using that reading development chart, that you'll notice is that there's an expectation by the time they're in this advanced fluent stage that they are very, very solid as text decoders. That reading fluently and adjusting for text type and really learning how to tackle these complex words that they're running into, that is firming up. These kids were pretty solid at that. You'll see that they stumble a little bit on some of the words as they read, but more of those content words and names of places and that sort of thing. But the text participant, user, and analyst work that happens in this stage, one of the things was they were approximating around almost all of this work. So again, these are kids that are very knowledgeable. They are active readers. And one of the things I want to do is to stretch that thinking work on even more. So here's the text, just going to see them reading. The book is called Animals in Danger, Orangutans. And in this book, the kids are thinking about what they're learning about orangutans. And this book has 3 sections. The first section describes the orangutan's life. What are orangutans? What do we know about them? And that's where this particular page comes from. The middle section talks about a lot of these issues with the disappearing rainforest. And then the third chunk of the book talks about people and what we can do to stop destroying the rainforest. So it's got these 3 really distinct chunks of text, but they're all really threaded through with meaning about how the orangutans live, what the challenges are for them in this day and age. And it has some of the most powerful visuals and graphics, and the kids really responded to those. You'll see them as they're talking through that. I got to be the lucky person, and this video makes me do nothing but chuckle every time I see it, as we got to talk about how the orangutans are gardeners of the forest, and they play this key role in making sure that seeds are spread through the forest, and how other animals are dependent on the plants that grow from those seeds that these orangutans are dispersing. And what's so hilarious is when the kids read this text, at first they're not quite sure what it is, but as they keep talking, you get to see the moment when it hits them what that actually means when we talk about seed dispersal in the jungle. So here we go, watching our kiddos. Now we're going to see the introduction first, then we'll see some reading and discussing, and then we will see the closure, and we'll stop and talk about each of those pieces as we go.
Okay.
Last week, when we were thinking and talking together, I remember all the notes that I was taking about things that you were thinking and doing as readers, and I put those onto a chart here. So these are some of the things that we've been thinking about. We use diagrams and photographs and other visuals to help us with the words and to help us to understand the ideas that were there. You guys had ways of figuring out the words by using other words and thinking about similar words and the visuals. And Maddie, there was the one that you shared with us about when you're trying to pronounce a word, looking for parts of the word that you know first, and then putting those parts together to say the word. And then this was something that, David, that you helped us with. Remember when we were talking in the salmon stream and how the salmon and the bear's life cycles began to overlap at some points? So you acted out how the visual worked, and then we sketched out some later on the book. So sometimes we sketch out or we act out our own visuals to help us understand the ideas. Have a book here for us to do some thinking and talking about, and really making sure today that when someone's sharing, how yet last week we were noticing how sometimes we got so involved in our own thinking that we weren't getting the ideas from other people. So today, just making sure when someone's sharing their thinking that you kind of park your idea off to the side and pay attention to that person's thinking, okay? And then we'll come back into our ideas. That's going to help us grow our thinking really big. All right? So a new book today called Animals in Danger, Orangutans.
Oh, I know about the orangutan.
Oh, talk to us. What do you already know there, David?
What I know about the orangutans are they're like apes because they're big like a human, and they sleep on the ground and they eat fruits.
Okay.
They only protect their young by staying in a group.
So you've got lots of thinking already. So take a couple moments and introduce this book to yourself. Go ahead, have a look through, introduce it to yourself. As you're looking through there, are there any things that are reminding you of things that you already know?
Yeah.
David began the moment he began to hear even the topic. Anything on there that looks familiar? Things that you might have already known some of?
Yeah. That they always had red hair.
So you're noticing some of the coloring?
Yep.
What it kind of reminds me of is that even though that they're like their names are called orangutans. They're kind of like the same species as apes and monkeys.
Ah, okay. Are there any particular words that you're expecting that we might run across in this book about orangutans? Animals in danger, orangutans.
Extinct.
Thinking you might run across it. I'm going to jot some of your words down that you're thinking might be in there.
They're kinds of foods.
Okay.
Habitat.
Any other words you're expecting to run across in there?
Wilderness. Wilderness or
In the wild.
endangered.
Endangered.
About their babies.
Okay. So maybe what word do they often use in nonfiction to talk about the babies? Do you have any other words for them? Newborns.
Oh yeah, that was it.
Sometimes I know they'll use the word offspring. Let's go take a peek at the table of contents together and see what you notice about that. So what kinds of information the authors included. Now these are new books, so you may have to press them down. Okay.
It tells us about the, what do you call it again? It tells you where you can find it, in which chapter and which page.
Okay. What kind of information did our author include in his book or her book?
About the orangutans and like what we're gonna be reading in the chapters.
What are they talking to us about? What information?
The orangutans are.
So we get the first chapter tells us what they are.
Yeah, the next
And then
chapter.
where does it go in chapter 2?
About the
cutting down the
rainforest,
rain,
yeah.
being captured and hunting.
Like it kind of like tells us what their predators are or who's hunting them. And the third one it just says like probably like what has to be done or something.
What makes you think that?
Because it says what is being
where
done.
they can-
What's being done, yeah. And see, do you notice how in the purple it has the sort of the big idea that goes along with that chapter? What are orangutans? Why are orangutans disappearing? And then saving the orangutans. Yeah, interesting. All right, so let's go in. As we read today, one of the things that we'll be doing is kind of noticing all of this important information the way we did before. And we were noticing that, there's lots of facts, lots of details, and what we have to do is put them together to think about some of those very important points with that. What we'll have you do today is just to, as you're reading, putting a sticky note when you think you've come across something that's a very important point for you.
Okay, so at this point, again, if we were live and together, I would have you turn and talk to your partners, but since we can't do that. So one of the things that always strikes me in here is the how many really effective reading strategies these kids have in place. A lot of times teachers wonder about how do you assess the kids, and one of the things I think you have to be prepared in guided reading to do is to take notes when you're noticing those strategies that kids are already using. So these kids have a lot of things in place. They are really starting about just automatically beginning to pull their background knowledge for ideas about the topic. They're beginning to think about vocabulary in the book. And again, this is one of those kinds of things of supporting kids to become automatically becoming having that expectation of the kinds of language they're going to be running across in a book, because that way when they get to a big huge word sometimes, or a very specific word, it's something they've already been anticipating and they've already thought about it, so that they're not going to have to do quite so much decoding to make sense of every word. They'll decode, but it's not going to be working their way through every single word that they're coming across. These kids are really strong at using the photographs and the other graphics to generate ideas before reading. And they're working to be a more collaborative group. And you notice there are times when they get a little self-conscious. I think part of that's the age level, but I think they're also, I'm asking them to deviate from a really known structured protocol. So this is something that when you start putting this kind of collaborative work in, one of the things that we sometimes do as teachers is we want to almost sometimes over teach it. So one of the things I think about is I always start with kind of noticing and naming strategies that they've used. Those could be reading strategies. Those could also be collaborative strategies. And one of those things that does is it helps kids to recognize, they already know a lot about this. And so taking that time at the beginning to set up the talk and the collaboration goals really supports that collaboration to grow stronger. So that's the work that I try and think about in this introduction. And then establishing this broad reading focus and stating it in student language. Like, I don't want to go so specific that kids just start going down one path, because one of the things we know is that as a reader, they have to integrate all of the reading strategies that they use. But I want to lift up and just help them to notice some of the work that they can do. So after this introduction, we began to read into the text, and we read the introduction to the book and stopped and talked about that. And what I'm going to do is pick us up in a discussion of chapter 1. The kids did the reading silently at the table with me for this particular work. As a teacher, I always think about my first reading or first lesson with the book or first session with the book. I want that to happen at the table, the reading work. So I don't want to give the kids the book beforehand and say, read this and then come prepared to talk. I can set up for other lessons like that, but I want to think about it in this first one. So the kids did the reading at the table with me, and then this is part of our discussion of chapter 1. And that piece around how the orangutans are the gardeners of the forest. And one of the kids had kind of been talking a little bit sort of broadly at the beginning, and then I used a question just to direct us into discussing that particular part.
I remember when we were using the headings to help us to figure out different parts, we wanted to make sure that we were thinking about what that section was about. What was this home range section all about there? What was important in that?
It's kind of like where they can like hang out, forage for food, and kind of like live and nothing can bother them.
Mm-hmm. What was important about that home range that they have, that space where they live?
That nothing can bother them.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Rosen? What did you
It says right here like that they're not aggressive if other orangutans are in their home range.
Mm-hmm. And do they move around a lot? Do they stay in the same place?
No, they move around a lot to search for food.
Okay. But is it kind of all over the rainforest or within just a spot in the rainforest?
It said here they move constantly throughout this area looking for food. These home range are about 2 to 4 square miles in size and often overlap with the home ranges of their orangutans.
So remember how when we talked about sketching out a visual?
Yeah.
What would that look like? So is that the whole rainforest or is that just part of the rainforest?
I think it's part of the rainforest.
Okay, so if this is sort of the whole rainforest, each orangutan has a spot,
yeah,
right? Has sort of a place in there.
It's a square.
And sometimes they overlap some.
So like some can like join together in one spot.
Mm-hmm. So now
Their houses could be connected, and then that's
their.
And just in case they could communicate to each other by just looking over.
Miss Debra, did you read this book?
I did. I read it too. So I was just noticing your thinking there with that.
Wait, are we gonna be like learning about why they can't like go somewhere else?
I think we might be learning that. Now, what did you find out in the introduction about what's happening to the rainforest? Because remember how we said we have to put different sections from the book together
I learned
to make it all make sense? What's happening to the rainforest?
It's
getting destroyed
Right.
by humans to clear out
all the
big areas.
So what happens if all of this part gets cleared out? What happens?
That is that this part of the animals are getting cleared out. So
and then they could go find like another section of where they live, and then just I guess they could like get everything that they had and just rebuild it inside of their home, and so it could just look exactly the same how it was.
And so what happens if it keeps doing this?
Then little by little, each part of the rainforest where the monkeys live, they're gonna have like little species of them.
Maybe there's like bigger parts of the rainforest, like somewhere else that they could go that the humans didn't find to go there.
Oh, interesting.
If the whole rainforest goes down, the orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, the orangutan will have no home, and without the orangutans, nothing would exist. Not even another tree. But
So what did it talk about if what happens if these animals, these orangutans they're endangered already? What happens if they go extinct? What were some of the ideas that you
It
marked?
said that it was somewhere in here, but it said that if they weren't here, that like some of the animals would die because of them, because they're their hope and stuff.
So where are you here?
Babies.
Gardeners of the forest. Check page 12.
Yeah.
So flip over to page 12. What did you highlight there? What did you tab? It's a very important point. On page 12, 13.
go ahead.
No, it's okay. Go.
Okay, it said that there are only 2 rainforests in the world where orangutans still live in the wild, but on the islands of Sumatra and Borneo, that's where only like some of them live in different islands.
Yes, Sumatra, I think is how you said it. Sumatra and Borneo. Yeah. And so we've got these 2 rainforests where these animals live, and you were talking, Rosamund, about how that there are other animals that are dependent on these animals. What did you guys find out about that? What it says they're the gardeners of the forest?
I learned that orangutans play an important role in the earth life chain, because like once they eat, they can actually like drop or leave seeds on the ground for them to grow, and that's why they're the gardeners of the forest.
Okay. And then go ahead. You found what you were looking for, Rosamund?
It says right here, due to vital role that orangutans play in maintaining a healthy forest, many other animals would be endangered if orangutans became extinct.
Why would other animals become extinct?
Because it says right here, like,
Maybe because go ahead, Frozen.
okay, it said that they eat the fruits and stuff, so they poop them out, and then they grow new plants. So probably like the other animals eat the plants that they made.
Totally makes sense. Sam, what do you think?
They're dropping the seeds from their butt, and then it's probably growing whenever the seed is growing.
Yeah. Well, that's how it happens out in the forest with the animals, isn't it? Yeah.
So I'll pause this right there. If you want to see the rest of that captivating conversation, you can watch the rest of that video on YouTube. But some of the things that just strike me as I watch and listen to the kids thinking is that, you know, the kids are really so interested in the topic and want to share. Sometimes I think they use text as thinking rather than to support thinking. So when I'd say to them, "What are you thinking?" they would read text aloud to me or to the group. And so one of the things I'm always thinking about is that I want the kids to understand that text is a support and to put their own thinking in. And that's, you know, they began to warm up, and you begin to see them become more comfortable sharing as the conversation went on. But you can see their aha moments. You know, one of the things that I do have kids do, as I said, is read silently here. And I think one of the things that we often mistake is that kids, when they're reading aloud accurately, that they've got comprehension. And I can guarantee you many of these kids could have read that text aloud, But what we saw was that wasn't the case, that they'd read the text themselves but didn't have that understanding. But through the conversation, they began to recognize things and notice things. So that collaborative conversation gives us a chance to figure out what kids are understanding, what maybe they're not understanding, and watch when those aha moments begin to happen as they collaboratively co-construct meaning together in that group. One of the things I think that my role has to be is to notice and name strategies that they're using, noticing what they do and helping them to learn to use those strategies again. So my role, a lot of this work is about figuring out, what they know and giving them the opportunity to, think about different parts of the question. I try to use really broad questions. What did you find out about the orangutans being the gardeners of the forest? Orangutan, what did you find out about, whatever. And I chuckle in this every time I see it. Because I think because I wasn't asking questions with so much information in them, Tyler wasn't sure if I'd actually read the book. So I just chuckle every time I watch him ask me, Miss Debra, have you read this book? Because one of the things I think we have to guard against is that kids get really good at using our questions to make meaning of the text. And a lot of times we can see they can make meaning with us, but not make meaning when they read independently. And I think that could be one of those challenges that could be there, is that kids are really used to the questions that we ask being a really support for their thinking. And that's not going to support them as they're learning to make meaning on their own. One of the things I try and do is use their ideas to generate my questions. There are a couple times I noticed myself sometimes though I can tell I'm thinking about my own question because I didn't acknowledge what they said and what was there. And so those are things that you just notice. I think if you videotape yourself as a teacher, you start to become a stronger listener and a stronger thinker about teaching. Again, I try to use their known strategies to support ways to help them extend their thinking. So just coming back to the strategy that they had used about sketching out to help them begin to visualize and think through the work that was there that they needed to be doing around that. One of the things I notice is that they are, learning to manage their conversation. And I am proud of myself when I see myself hold back, because I can see it's a little frustrating for some of them to not have someone helping them manage their way into a conversation. And so I'm just trying to intentionally stay out of that and let them do some of that work and that fumbling around. What I do notice for myself, though, is I think I talk too much in that video. So if you noted that for yourself, I would agree with you. So one of the biggest challenges in the world is not talking so much within the lesson. So we always live and learn, and I always say these videos are not perfect videos. They are just videos to prompt discussion. So after the reading and discussing piece, then what we want to have is a closure. And even in this conversation, which just basically dissolves into us having a good laugh about what's going on in the jungle with these animals and as Rosewind giggles and says, pooping them out, I do have to have a closure on the lesson. And so that's what this next piece is going to show you. It's a very short little clip where we'll just pick it up from seeing how we come out of that conversation into our closure.
So we're not going to have that conversation right now. Thank you very much.
Let's just move on.
Yeah, let's move on.
Let's move on.
So let me have you close your book up, because you've done this really important reader work today.
That was disgusting.
You're okay. So let me talk to you a little bit about what you did today as readers. So you were, as you were reading through this, noticing all these very important ideas. You were marking them. And then the other things that you were thinking about were how you had to put ideas from one part of the book with another part of the book to get the bigger ideas put together. Yeah. And then sometimes you read it, and when other people start talking about it, you start figuring things out, because I kind of heard when some of this made sense after the funny part of the book. You can't hold the giggles anymore. It is kind of one of those funny parts with the book.
Find something out. I wonder what that was.
Yeah. And then when your brain gets that, you can't help it. No, that's all you can think about, right?
You know how, like you said, said from another part, like from chapters. I have an idea from another book,
What's that idea?
Remember that other book that we did, like
The salmon? About the salmon stream?
Are if it said like that bears also eat plants, are the orangutans eating the plants that they make? I'm just curious, okay? I'm curious about
I can hear your curiosity coming out in that question. Yeah. So we may have to think about that, because that's exactly what happens as you begin reading. You begin to see these patterns of how things happen from book to book. So you're putting them together.
And nothing makes me happier than when I watch the thinking work that these kids are doing. This group just always makes me happy when I watch them. So some of the things that I notice in that closure is really how they're generating an authentic response to the text ideas. I mean, this is those things that are funny, and we just kind of have to go with that work. And, one of the things as well is the more that I'm helping them notice and name the strategy work that they do, they begin to notice their own strategy work even more. So that's one of the things that closure helps us to do as teachers, is to help kids to begin to recognize what they're already doing. My work in noticing and naming the strategy use really, I think, helps the kids to feel more empowered about their abilities as learners. And that's one of the things I just try and always think about, is that my work has to help them to see themselves as the brilliant people that they already are. When we talk about in guided reading that we're not teaching strategies, so this is not the place where I introduce new strategies or new skills. This is a place where I help kids to really solidify the orchestration of skills that they're already doing. And so one of the things I notice and name here is their collaborative work. Normally that's going to occur in a lesson, but in this one I did not, but I really should have noticed and named that work. One of the other things that I always try and think about is when I'm working with the kids, I want that lesson to be around 20 to 25 minutes or so. And so in looking at the guided reading structure, what I've got to think about as a teacher is my timing. So an introduction is going to be anywhere from 5 to 8 minutes. And I'm going to talk just this in one lesson, but my next PowerPoint slide is going to show you what you do when you're working with kids across multiple days in a text. But an introduction is typically 5 to 8 minutes or so. Reading and discussing around 10 to 12, where the kids are talking. We're talking a little bit about a chunk of text. They read the text, we reflect on it. They lead the discussion. They're reading the text independently and silently. And my work is facilitating the discussion and checking for understanding. Then that closure piece is going to be 1 to 2 minutes. And one of the things that I have to think about as a teacher is I would have really liked to have had more conversation about another piece of the text. But in noticing the timing, what I realized was if I ask them about another piece of text in that reading and discussing portion, then what's going to happen is it makes my lesson go extremely long. So one of the things in terms of timing is noticing, how long have we got, how long have we been going, and then making sure that I leave time for that closure. Because what I don't want to do is to say, okay, everybody close their book and let me bring another group up, or let's run off to lunch or do whatever it is. Now those times are approximate, but you think you're shooting for 20 to 25 minutes with that group. And if you're using a text that is a single text over multiple days, that timing is going to look a little bit different in terms of the work. Now, every session that you work with a group of kids on is going to have an introduction, a reading and discussing, and a closure, a before, during, and after reading. So that's going to occur in every one of this. But in the first session that you just saw, one of the things that my introduction does is it also includes an introduction to the text overall. So that may make that introduction in a first session go a little bit longer. Then I'm going to have reading and discussing, and then a closure. In the subsequent sessions, and that session could happen the following day, it could happen a couple of days later, depends on the kids, depends on the topic, depends on the book, whether or not I'm going to put them back to back. But on the subsequent days, what you see is that there's a little bit of a flip in the timing. My introduction is going to be shorter than the reading and discussing. All right. So in the introduction on the subsequent session, one of the things that I want to do to start off is reviewing the previous session's ideas. And I don't want to do that by saying to kids, okay, what did we learn about yesterday? Because I could spend 10 minutes roaming around in that. And what I want to do is just very quickly, a quick summary. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to review, yesterday we talked about, whatever it was. And then I'm going to be introducing them into today's reading selection. Or I might be saying, last night you were going to read chapter 2. Let's talk a little bit about what kind of things you found out as you were reading. So I'm going to be introducing them into today's reading. Then we're going to talk about, what the reading portion was for today. So whatever the chunk of text was that we're going to have a conversation around. Then I have to decide, am I going to prepare them for reading some more of the text on their own? And if I need to allot time for that. Because one of the things, especially if I'm in a nonfiction text, I might want to have them think about where they're going to read, where they're going to stop, maybe notice the headings, get our ideas, get ready for what we're going to be finding out. So doing a very tiny little introduction to that chunk of text that they're going to read on their own. If it's a fiction text, we might be, beginning to anticipate storyline and think about, what are you thinking might happen next based on what we've read so far, kind of conversation. But whatever happens in that conversation, I have to make sure that I do include a closure for that lesson where I take a moment to reflect on the work that we've done as readers today, as meaning makers today, as we've collaborated together. So a first session and a subsequent session. Now, one of the things that often is a conversation and a question at this point is people talk about wanting to use chapter books in guided reading. And one of the things I try and think about is if you go back to our session on supports and challenges, I think it was our webinar number 3, we talked about how the texts are constructed in an intentional way to support particular aspects of reading to occur. And it's not that we're not going to be using that same kind of thinking work in other texts. The challenge becomes sometimes that the texts are so long that we try to bring into a guided reading lesson. So if I'm trying to bring in a book like Wonder or Hatchet or, novels like that, that text could be so long that it takes us forever to read it. And by the time we finish with the text, then the kids are kind of tired of the guided reading lesson and they've lost most of the meaning. So if you're going to use a chapter book like that, think about your purpose in using it. What would be the part of the text that I want to use in guided reading? Because what I would think about is if it's a fiction text, I might just want to use the first, 2 or 3 chapters, because that's oftentimes the challenge in a novel like that is figuring out who the characters are and in beginning to form a good picture of what's going on in the text and what's going on with those characters. So I might be using a portion of it. What I don't want to do though is begin thinking of guided reading as a literature circle, because literature circles are a kind of independent reading. They're not a substitute for guided reading, because I think they occur in different places. When you think about gradual release, when you think about the amount of teacher support, guided reading, the teacher selects the text, the teacher designs the lesson, the teacher decides kind of how far we're going in the book each day and goes into that facilitation work. In literature circles, we want kids to be planning that kind of work out for themselves. So, literature circles are a less supported practice. Just because they're in small group doesn't mean that they're guided reading. So I try and think a lot about that kind of work as kids are going into that. So lots of different kinds of things going on in a guided reading lesson and different ways that you're thinking about text use and different work. But the teacher's role throughout all of this is facilitation. So when you think about facilitating within a guided reading lesson, one of the things that I keep coming back to is this idea that guided reading is a collaborative conversation. So conversations with their peers improves comprehension and engagement with text. And so what we want to think about is in a conversation like this, we want kids to analyze and comment on and compare and really to think deeply about what it is that they've read. And so to do that, I have to sometimes shift the way that I'm working with kids. And so rather than me asking them lots and lots of questions, what I want to do is support them to engage and to use some different key prompts. So one of the things I think that is the hardest way of working is being silent, because one of the hardest things in the world is to stop talking. And you know, when I reflect back on the video, in this particular lesson with these kids, one of the things I notice is that I need to use more silence. I need to give kids more space for thinking, and give them those moments for coming in. And then using broad questions like, what are you thinking? And I can complete this into, what are you thinking about how orangutans are the gardeners of the forest? I can use some additional words in that question, but what I don't want to do is to say, you know, something like, how are the animals gardeners of the forest as they spread seeds from the fruit that they've eaten? Like, I don't want to add all that information in, because what I'm doing here with this kind of facilitation is helping me as a teacher to assess what the kids are attending to and what they're ignoring. Because through that conversation, one of the things that I was noticing was, while these kids were very strong about using the text and reading text aloud as they're thinking, one of the things that I began to notice was that they would sometimes cherry pick. They picked out text that went with thinking that they were doing, but there were things in the text that they were completely ignoring as they went along. So that's the kind of thing that I'm only going to know if I have kids talking about their thinking, and giving them the opportunity to expand on it. So when they say, share out some thinking, what I want to do is probe with something like, tell us more, or say more about that. You know, what makes you think that? What in the text got you thinking about that? And then supporting kids to think about different ideas that are coming out. So rather than me acknowledging and saying, yes, that's a right answer, or that's a good answer, what I want to do is to say, what did you all think about that idea that so-and-so shared, so that we can begin to consider another person's perspective in the conversation. One of the things that I'm doing within all of this facilitation is also then shifting into that listener role. Because as I said before, the more that I'm hearing from what kids are saying, the more that I'm able to see what levels of understanding they're demonstrating in their thinking. We often think of these levels here, literal, interpretive, and analytical, critical, these levels of understanding as questions. You know, oh, it's a literal question, or oh, it's an analytical question. But I think of it more as a way for me to begin to assess the thinking work that kids are sharing. Because what I know is that comprehension doesn't happen at one point. You know, it's that process that kids are going through as they're making meaning, and it's a collaborative process. And so the more that they talk and think together, what I begin to see is the work that they're capable of. And I don't want to do something for the child that they're learning to do for themselves. So what happens after they read the book in guided reading? Well, one of the things I want to do is make sure that kids have opportunities to reread the books in partnerships and have extended conversations around the text. So offering that book to them. Now, every book they're not going to want to take, because you may have some kids that are really into this topic, and other kids that it just doesn't really grab them once we get past certain things, but I want to give them the opportunities for that. And the thing that I also want to do is make sure that we have a lesson where we synthesize the book together, so that I can support kids to recognize how each of the books is bringing different concepts to life. The key concepts that connected Animals in Danger, orangutans, with the fiction text, Ahmad's Journey, that partners with this book and pairs together, is that human activities and industry and everyday life have had major effects on land, and that people are influenced by both positive and negative emotions and incentives when they're making different decisions. And so one of the things that I'm bringing the kids back together to do after several sessions with each of these books is to come back and talk about the book together. And one of the things that always strikes me about this particular video clip was that notion of community. One of the students had told Tyler, who's the little fella who was sitting to my, would be to my left, the one who was sharing there at the end in the closure. And one of the students had told Tyler that he talked too much. And one of the things that I was noticing in this synthesis lesson was that he was really feeling self-conscious. And it just, again, helps me become even more aware of how important community is, and helping kids to realize how they work in groups and how they talk to each other really impacts someone's thinking. And so this just to me is visual proof of the importance of community within this. So let's watch and think about what we notice happening in the synthesis lesson as the kids are thinking about these books together.
So we've had time to think and talk about Animals in Danger, our orangutans book, and we've talked about Ahmad's Journey. And what I want us to do is to think about these books together. And in both of these books, we've talked about different decisions that people had to make. And I want you to think about this question. What are some decisions that people have made that affect the orangutans, that have caused them to become endangered? And why do you think people make those decisions?
They cut the trees so they can make more homes and stuff, like more buildings.
So why do you think people made that decision?
So because there's not enough room for other people to move in, because since all the other people took the houses and stuff, so they had to cut off the trees so that they could get more homes and they can build them. Mm-hmm. But they're taking away the orangutan's home.
Do you think people were thinking about that at the beginning?
No.
Tyler, you talked to us a lot about, can you find that graphic of those circles? Those are called pie graphs that show how the forest was disappearing over time. What kind of decisions do you think people were making along the way here? Tyler, what are things that you're thinking about, those decisions? This was so helpful to us as we began to think about how this rainforest is disappearing. So what were you thinking there about decisions people might be thinking about there?
I think that people are thinking that destroying the forest might be a good way of collecting palm oil to make products.
So having more places to grow that palm oil? What kind of decision, what do you think caused them to make that decision? They want to grow more palm oil because why?
So they can make more products to make more money.
Ooh, came down to money for you too? David, you talked about money in the last, when we were talking about Ahmad's Journey. What do you think caused people to make this decision to take that rainforest land?
Well, I said that they were selfish and all they wanted was just money. I think that the people they're making the orangutans endangered because they want to kill them and sell them and cut down the rainforest so they won't have any shelter no more and they could make them as pets.
Well, why would someone decide that they wanted an orangutan as a pet?
Maybe just because they're on the loose because they don't have the rainforest no more, and that like I said, they could just use it and they could die and then they could sell the parts.
I think they want them as pets because to probably get attention.
The person who owns the orangutan gets attention. What does that do for someone, do you think? How does it make someone feel?
Oh, they're gonna be now I could be rich and I could get famous because I'm the only one that has an orangutan, and they just want attention from other people.
I saw pauses right there. And one of the things that I just always think about with this is how the kids have, the more that they talk about a topic, the more they get comfortable articulating their thinking. And they're beginning, I see the signs that they're beginning to learn to talk more as a group. Again, I think the challenge sometimes is that kids, when they have very rigid protocols for conversation, they often kind of lose their abilities to learn to navigate a conversation in a more comfortable way. So, I think that's the key, is just really making sure that we're helping kids to think about, what can you do if two people are talking at once, and what's the kind of work that we can do. These kids were really strong, I think, about integrating and sharing ideas from past discussions. There were lots of echoes of the other conversations that we had through the week that we were working together with these two texts. That was really reflected in this work. My role is asking really conceptual questions to help them to think about ideas that link the book. What we don't want to try and do is ask literal what connects the books. These one of the things about these Okapi pairs is that they're connected around conceptual ideas, not about these, like, one's about an orangutan and another one's about an orangutan, but these bigger understandings that are posed and working through there. Again, my work is asking probing questions to expand on their thinking, coming back to ideas from other discussions of the text. Again, one of my roles as a teacher is jotting down sometimes some of the ideas that the kids have been thinking and talking about across this, and then supporting them to connect their thinking to others' ideas. So that particular lesson, one of the things I want to do is make sure that I have a day that is just about putting the text together. And you want to be able to do that with a variety of text. And one of the things that kind of lesson does is it models for kids the kind of things that they could do independently. One of the other collections that comes along with these materials, these pairs, is a collection of articles called Perspectives. And each of these pairs has a text that looks at different issues and concepts that surround that particular pair. For example, this one is disappearing rainforests. What are the issues? One of the kinds of things we want to get kids to start noticing is because within each of these texts, there are different persuasive text devices that authors use. And so having these types of graphic organizers like the one in the center here, where kids begin to notice language, and then offering them different ways of responding to text, some of the different kinds of things that they might do, where they go and research an issue if it is something that speaks to them, or using art to create a poster, or poetry or rhyme and rap and songs, and all the different ways that they can transform their learning and understandings together. That really provides an opportunity for kids to do the kind of meaningful, independent work that really keeps kids active in the thinking work, but it's a way of extending the thinking that we've been doing together. One of the things that connected text like this does over time is it develops obviously greater comprehension on the topic, but it also develops a range of reading strategies, enables kids to think about a topic from different perspectives, supports them to write in different ways, because what we know as a reader, what we know as a writer, we know first as a reader. So the variety of text types and the different ways that authors are communicating their messages is really powerful. And that's one of the things that we know connected text allows kids to experience and see. And it also supports their language abilities to move from explorational kinds of tentative talk to presentational, where they're beginning to use more academic language and vocabulary. And again, all of this kind of work is supporting kids to develop in all of the roles of readers that they can possibly do, not just text decoders, but kids who are able to understand with meaning, recognize the roles that texts play and the way that they're used to communicate messages, and recognizing that every author is going to have a point of view and is going to, have a voice, and recognize whose voices are represented and whose voices are missing in all the conversations. That's the kind of thinking work that we want kids to be doing independently. But what we know is that they only grow into the intellectual life that surrounds them. So the more that we're having those conversations in whole group, and then again in small group, the more that kids are going to be able to take that work off into independent time and live their lives in those ways. So this is the last of our webinar series on guided reading. So thank you so much if you've held in there from the beginning to the end, or if you've just joined us for a few of them. You can access all of these webinars at myokapi.com. Go to Literacy Voices, and then there's a category link to webinars, and all of the webinars that are here listed on the screen are found there on the Okapi website. Again, thank you so much for joining us for all of these, and take care, and hope to see you soon.